Yo, you know that I've been your CEM through this process, and what you all don't know is I got a promotion like 2-ish months ago. That means that I have a lot of other things on my plate. Super cool. I'm still at launch code, love my job, but probably not managing classes. And y'all probably don't know this because you haven't ever worked with me before. I've been a lot more hands-off because of that. And so we really needed to get someone hired. And I'm so glad to get to introduce you all to Colin Brock, who is going to be your candidate engagement manager moving forward. What this means for you, you'll see a different face on this Zoom. A different person will be giving announcements occasionally, and posting in Slack. Colin might be a little more hands-on than I am. You might see messages from him about outstanding assignments or things like that, or catch-up planning and things like that. This is because we all want you to succeed, and Colin is here to help you do that. For now, because today is literally Colin's first day, for now, when you send, if you're like, man, I want to send Clark a message, send it to Colin and me. That lets me kind of see what's going on, help Colin figure out if you send like a buck wild question and we don't know how to apply. I can help Colin out a little bit, but it gives us a little more transparency and a little more openness and helps make this transition a little bit easier. Because I know you all probably have started new jobs. You know how much happens in the first couple of weeks of starting a new job. So we're going to give Colin a little bit of grace by whenever you need to message a CEM, message us both. I'll let Colin go ahead and introduce himself real quick.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you, Clark. And nice to meet everybody here. Clark pretty much covered it. I'll be taking over most of his duties, just very gradually over the course of the next couple of weeks. A little bit about me. I was also a student for Launch Code. I went through Code Camp, so it was the full-time course. So I can't imagine working a full-time job and then doing this in the evening. So I applaud everybody here for making that work. And yeah, I just I'm looking forward to getting to know people in here. And as Clark mentioned, if you have any needs or you have any questions, any non-coding related questions that you have, direct them to me, but make sure and pin Clark on there as well. And yeah, thanks for the intro, Clark.
You all are in such good hands. Colin has done some really good work with Launch Code in the past. I'm so excited to have him come on as your new CEM. So yeah. And so I think that's all, and we'll give Carrie the time back.
All right. Thanks, Colin. Really glad to have you. Thanks, Clark. We're going to miss you. I know I'm going to miss you big time. Clark is fantastic to work with. Okay, so let's get started with our lecture for this evening. And I forgot to get my slideshow set up, so give me just a second here. There we go. All right. Share screen. Yada, yada, same old, same old. And I always manage to narrate it as I'm doing it. Y'all have noticed, right? Okay, here we go. So tonight we are talking about HTTP and forms. This is tacking on to last class where we were working with just, basic DOM events. And now we are going to really get into something that's very, very useful for interaction with users, and that is forms, of course. So we'll be doing more with event listeners and such. Okay, so announcements and then lecture and then studio review. Basic classic format this week again. Okay, so we said hi to Colin. There's no class on Thursday. Happy Thanksgiving. Enjoy your time off. And then the graded assignment number 5 deadline is not until the 8th of December. It's a little bit more spaced out this time. So that will give you a little bit of a breather. That being said, you already know half of what, most of what you need for that assignment. There's a little bit we'll be talking about next Monday that will kind of complete that for you, but you could get started over the holiday weekend if you want to spend some time on it now. There will be a catch-up class, the class before on the 5th. All right, let's talk about HTTP. This is how we move data across the web. Well, it's one of the ways. We'll talk about the basics of how the internet works, talk about HTTP requests and HTTP responses. Internet basics. So you've got the clients and servers. So what we mean by client is this is the resource that your user has, something like a browser that is going to request and receive data and allow the user to interact with it. And the server is what provides the data. So you can kind of see in this diagram here, this is what we generally think of, right? We have our different devices that are, sending and receiving things across the internet. And there's a server on the back end of that is providing the data that we are requesting. So even though you think of these things as being in two different locations, when you are developing on your local machine and you're running your application, you're actually having both the server and the client on the same machine. And I have a little sticker, one of many, many stickers on my laptop that says there's no place like 127.0.0.1, which is something we also call home that or local host that is represents your local server. So, okay, so along with that, we'll talk about protocols. So HTTP is used for sending basic data, your pages, your images, all that kind of thing across the internet. And if it has an S on the end, that means it's a secure connection, security thing. TCP IP is just something you'll see that's for very small bits of data that's sent just a little bit at a time. And then DNS is something that keeps track of what website name goes with what IP address numerically. So when you see DNS, that's what that's referring to, is the domain names. So another name for a web address is URL. You're probably fairly used to that. And the different parts, though, are a scheme, host, port, path, and query string. And only scheme and host are required, but they always go in that specific order from left to right, even if you include the optional ones. So here's some examples. We've got this abcwebsite.org. We're going to this products page, but we're specifically going to look at a product that has the ID number 12354. I'm sorry, 52. So the scheme in these examples is the HTTPS or the HTTP. And then the host is the website itself, the domain name. And in the second example, you see I've got localhost. That is one of the aliases for your home host. And then in the second example, you'll also see I have a port number. That happens to be, if you haven't already noticed, you know how when I'm using VS Code and I use live server extension to, bring up the page in the browser, 5500 is the default port that live server uses. When we get to Angular, it'll default to port 4200. When you guys get to running Spring Java applications in Unit 2, Tomcat uses, oh wow, I'm totally blanking. Is it, it starts, gosh, oh no, 8080, that's it. And then there's other ones. React has, its own default and these kinds of things. So that's what the port is. And then that's the path. It can be just a directory or it can be a file name specifically. And then there's the query string. Always starts with a question mark. And then it has key value pairs that are, tied together with equal signs. And if you have additional ones, you use an ampersand between each key value pair. Okay, so those are kind of the parts of a URL. So let's talk about the request that is made by the client. It's made up of several parts. The very first part is the method, the path, and the HTTP version. So you can kind of see in this example, which I stole from your textbook because it was a good example. That very first line says get and /blog/ and HTTP 1.1. That's the method, get, the path, blog, and the version. After that, the next block of text that you see over several lines is the request headers. Each one of them is a key value pair, and each one appears on a different line. We'll talk about what some of these mean later. The request body is anything that comes after that. You'll often hear this kind of generally referred to as the payload, and that always comes after the blank line. So we're going to take a look at this in a couple minutes, actually in the browser using DevTools, and you'll kind of see some examples of how this works. And that's always going to be on the network tab in browser DevTools. Actually, we can just look at it now. Why not? Okay, for this, I'm actually using Firefox and not Chrome, because for the network tab, I like the Firefox a lot better. It shows you the status here, on the left, a lot more clearly which method it is. It's telling you what the domain name is, the file. And this is actually this is one of my graded assignment prep exercises that I've got in my document. It's a little thing that goes and fetches data from the Open Trivia database, an API that's out there, and you use a little form to choose how many questions you want. So I could say 8 questions, what category, do I want multiple choice, true or false? I can leave it blank if I want either. And then what difficulty, let's say medium, and then go. And then you'll notice that it made some new requests here, right? And this one right here is the one we are mostly interested in, because this is the one that just came back with the question. So let's look at the request first. Oh yeah, there's no payload on the actual quest because I used these parameters. If you actually look at this way, you can see the query string, right? Everything from here to here. So there's the token, which is the API token I had to get in order to successfully get a response from their server. The amount, the category, and the difficulty, which I just chose up here. And if I expand this, you can kind of see those broken down, all of the query parameters right here after the scheme and host and the file name. So this is, you can get a lot of information from this. And we'll come back to this in just a second. So I can talk about the response side of things. So let's go back to the slides. Oh, but first I want to talk about request methods. Yeah, because there's, a bunch of different ones. I'm going to kind of go over the 2 main ones you're going to use tonight or talk about tonight, and then a couple that you might use in the future, in the fairly near future. So get is for retrieving information. That's all it does. So you typically don't expect to have to send any data except for maybe the headers. And you're just asking for something to come back. And then so this would be like loading a page, fetching data and images to display on your page. And then post is for sending information to create new data on a server. So you're submitting a form with information to save to a database. Let's say you're signing up for an account on a website for the first time. You create a username, you create a password. You might go in and put some additional information in your user profile. All of those things would be done by a post request when you fill out those forms, because it's the first time that the entire thing is being saved to the database. Sending an email would be a post request. And then there's these other ones that we'll talk about more later on in the course. Put is for updating existing information. If it already is out there, but you're just changing it, like you update your address with your bank, that's a put request. Patch is for making very small partial updates. It doesn't happen too often, but there's a distinction between put and patch, and I just wanted you to at least have seen it once. Then delete is for removing data altogether from the server. You go and you say, I just want to clear that whole thing out. And you send along information to specify what it is that you're deleting. So there's others, but those are the ones you'll probably see the most. And I wanted to mention this now because I didn't put this together as a student until much later. But we're going to discuss CRUD operations when we get to Unit 2, and we're working with Java. Create, read, update, delete. Now these correspond to these HTTP requests. So create would be post, read would be get, update would be put or patch, and delete would be delete, right? So I just kind of wanted to throw that out there because when we talk about CRUD again in the future, you'll know that this is exactly what we're talking about is these types of operations and requests. Okay, and then some of the common headers for requests are the host, the user agent, which is information about the client you're using, what type of data that they'll accept, and sometimes it's more than one, but text/HTML is one example that they give here, and then content type, and this is important for post requests when you've got, we're going to talk about JSON in the next class. But an XML is another common type of the way that data is packaged up to send it so that it can be unpackaged and read on the other end, no matter what language or framework you're using. Okay, so that's kind of the basics of requests. Now let's talk about response. So this is the server responding to the client. So this is everything kind of coming back this other direction, right? You've got a status line with the code. In this example here, the code is 200, okay. And then you've got response headers and a response body, also known as payload. And so the structure of it is very similar. You just probably see some slightly different information. And the response can be a lot of different things depending on what it is you've requested. Again, you can review the contents on the network tab in your browser DevTools. We'll do that in just a second. I'm going to finish going through this. Okay, so these response codes, there's kind of 5 categories. 1XX is informational, the 100, group. You don't see this very often, but it's like the request was received, but we haven't finished processing it. This one you see all the time, if everything is working properly, some sort of like 200 response that the request was valid and the server successfully responded. 300 is like, redirection. You made this request here, but we're actually going to redirect you over here. And then anything in the 400 block is a client error. In other words, this is a mistake that I made in the way that I set up this request somehow, and there can be a lot of different ways to do it wrong. And there's a whole host of different error codes that could come back. And sometimes they're very specific, and it's very helpful to understand the distinctions, because then you're like, oh, I think I know what I did wrong. 500 is when there's a server error. There's something on the back end that's actually not right, and it has nothing to do with anything that you did in your request. Probably. So common codes that you'll see are 200, okay, which means it went through, we're good. 301 is the most common redirect code. 404 not found. Everyone has seen that probably at least once, where you go to a web page and the link, on somebody's website is out of date and it just doesn't exist. And so you get a 404 page, and sometimes they're very creative and funny. It can be entertaining. 500 is a classic, just basic server error that's not very specific, and there are more specific ones. If you've got a good team, in your company that's designing everything on your back end, they're putting together a lot of really specific codes that help out the front end developers to know exactly what it is that didn't go quite right. Or even the developers, if you're working with like other businesses and they're using your products, that can be really important. There's even an April Fool's joke that someone made with 418 called "I'm a teapot." This is a real thing, guys. And some people actually use it when they don't want to allow a request. It basically is just saying you're trying to brew coffee, but I'm a teapot. You can't do that. That's how it came about. So just for fun, I thought I'd throw that in. All right, common response headers. Again, content type, and you can specify the length, content length, the location are things, like if there's a relocated resource, that can be helpful. Okay, so let's go over here and look back at our example. So in this case, I made this request, right? A GET request to the Open Trivia database, and I gave them all the specific query parameters. And so then they come back with a response. And in this case, it's of type JSON. And whoa, mouse is doing weird things. And you can see that it's an array with an array of objects. So the DevTools here is kind of showing us that. But then they give us each index in the array, and they show us this is an object, and then you can see all of the properties of each object. So it's got a category, type, difficulty, question, and the correct answer, and then the incorrect answers. And then you can do with that what you will. So I created a little program to display those and allow the user to choose one, and and then give them feedback. Was it correct or not correct? But it all started with the data that came back from my request. So this is the response. So you can do a lot with a lot of stuff out there. And when in the next class, when we talk about JSON and fetch, we're going to have a lot of fun with that. And then later, when you guys are doing your capstone projects as part of liftoff after graduation, for those of you who decide to do that, one of the requirements will be that you use some sort of API and use some data. So you'll get good practice with this then too, and probably in a more sophisticated manner. So yeah, so this is something that's just super useful. I highly recommend. Again, so far we've been working mostly on the inspector tab, right, and the console. And apparently I have funny little console logs that I forgot about. But this is the network tab. So this is just another one of the places you can go in DevTools. And that's where you can get, all this information about your requests. You'll notice I've got a 404 here. It tried to get the icon that is supposed to go up here next to the title on the tab. And evidently it's not available. So I got a 404 not found on that for some reason. And this was a get call that I actually made before I displayed things on the page, just to get the available categories. I didn't want to have to retrieve them from the data. I needed to actually go get them first so that I could create this drop-down list here, and also make sure that it's the most current thing based on whatever they've got in their API, because maybe they've gotten rid of a category or they've added a category. This make sure I'm always getting the most recent list that they've got. So yeah, so there's some examples of all of that. Let's go move on, because forms is going to take a bit to get through. You're going to get some practice tonight with HTTP stuff, so no worries there. So for forms, we're going to talk about the basic form elements, labels and values, different types of input elements, and all the little particulars that are unique to each of them. I'll talk about buttons and form submission, and also a little bit about validating user input. And then we're going to do a little code along. If I don't know how much time we're going to have, but we're going to try. Okay. Your studio is not super long, so I might actually go, a little long. We'll see. Okay, so form elements. You use the tag form to create a form. Who knew? But this actually is important. I mean, you could use a div, but the difference is the browser knows how to automatically handle things. It recognizes it as a form cohesively, and it can submit things kind of automatically sometimes just by enclosing all of your inputs in the form tag. There's different tags you can use with your form, like input, select, and button. We're going to go over each of these. And most of the time, your input fields will need a label so that you can actually, put something on the page next to the field to tell the user what it represents, what it is that they're filling out. Common input attributes on the tag are type, name, and value. They're, sometimes even required in certain cases. We'll kind of go over that as we go over each individual input type. And it's also common to use class and ID for styling and for accessing with JavaScript for working in the DOM. So labels and values. There's kind of a couple ways to apply a label to an input. You can either wrap the label around the input so that the input's nested inside it, and then just put the label text like either just to the left of the input or just to the right of the input. Or you can assign an ID to your input and then use the attribute for on the label, and then give it the same value as the ID. And then it knows that they're connected. And that second method, aside from being easier to style in certain circumstances, it's also cool because it allows the user, if they click on the label and they click like right next to the input, it'll still bring the input field into focus, so they can just kind of start typing without them having to click into the input. So there's a couple of examples here. You'll see, you know, the first one is where I've got the label wrapped around the input. I've put the input in a different color to make it a little easier to pick that out. And then I've put the text of the label username there on the left of it. And then the second example is where I've done it completely separately because I wanted to like put my label after it and then just have that for attribute to tie them together with the ID of the input. So make sure if you're going to do it that way, that you put an ID on it and don't try to use the name, because those are two different things. For values of your fields, the value is generally going to be whatever the user has entered into the field or selected it, if it's like a checkbox. But you can set a default value, so there's something already there if you want to. In the DOM, the value property corresponds to this attribute. So, you know, if you've created an element for this thing that I've got, this example I've got over here, this input, you could create something that says, you know, I'm going to say user input and then, you know, document.get element by ID and, you know, choose the user input ID. And then you could just say user input.value, and that would go get whatever the value is. So that's extremely useful when you are trying to work with the data that's provided to you by the user. So let's talk about some of these different input elements. I might go kind of fast through this, but it's because I would rather go fast and then show you, have time to show you. But there's distinctions for everything. This is the default. However, if you just use an input and you don't give it a type, it's going to default to type equals text, but it's always better to be explicit. So put type equals text on there. But it essentially allows user to enter any characters with any format that they want. And the value is just going to be whatever they've entered. You can, again, set a default value so there's something already there if you want to. You can also add a placeholder, which is like grayed out text that's behind it. I'm sure you've seen this when you filled out forms. That kind of gives you an example. And it isn't actually like in the field, it's not a value. So as soon as they start typing, it disappears and then they see the actual value that they're putting in. Min length and max length are two additional attributes you can put to kind of put boundaries on how short or how long the input can be. And the browser will honor that and prevent them from doing anything that's too long and validate it if it's too short. So the input tag is self-closing. You may have noticed that already from examples. So there's an example down here where I've got a city and I've got a little placeholder, and you can kind of see that the text is a little grayer, and you can change the color of that if you want to by specifying the placeholder value. And then, yeah, that's pretty much it. So that's a default text input. That's one example. Number input, you also use the input tag, but you just do type equals number. The browser will validate it, that it can be converted to a valid number, which could be an integer or a decimal number, before the form submission is allowed. The value is actually going to be a string. Any sort of input is going to start with a value that's a string. But if it's a valid number, you can convert it to a number, no problem. You can give it a default value, or you can use a placeholder for this one as well. You can also specify min, max, and step attributes. So like if you know it always needs to be a positive number, you can put a min on it and say, you know, it needs to be 0 or it needs to be 1. Step is like, maybe you want it to increase by 5. So it can only go like 5, 10, you know, 15, 25, 20, 25. That would be a step. And there's an example there for you. And you can kind of see, like on my device, my Mac, it gives me the little up and down arrows, so I can actually use those, or I can just type it in either way. The email input is very similar to a text. It looks like a text field. But when you try to submit the form, if it's not proper email format, which basically just means it has to have something in front of the @ symbol, and then it has to have something dot something after, at least after the @ symbol, that's like the most basic email format. So it'll just prevent its submission if it isn't quite right. The value is a string. You can give it a default value. You can also use a placeholder. So this is an example where I actually it doesn't show the placeholder property in this part, but I actually did do it before I made this little screenshot, so you can see that there. The date input is pretty cool, especially if you're trying to make something compatible, like for mobile devices. It's a lot easier usually. So type equals date. Every device is a little different. And sometimes the browser will allow invalid formats to be typed in, but it'll validate that it's a real date before it allows you to submit. And the value is always in the format year, 4-digit year, dash 2-digit month, dash 2-digit date. That's the kind of the value that it's holding behind the scenes, no matter what you actually are doing on the UI. And so with that in mind, if you want to give it a default value, you need to use that format. And if you want to use min and max values, you also have to use that format on your attribute values. Okay. So the radio input, this is where you want something to be mutually exclusive. You want to have a group and you only want them to be able to choose one. So you use the input thing again. Most of them are input tags, but this one's type equals radio. And you definitely need to add a label to make sure it's clear what the, oh, that says checkbox, it should say radio button, to make sure what that represents. And then in order for it to work as a group and for them to be mutually exclusive, they all have to have the same name. So ordinarily you're thinking of name as being something where you want every single input to be unique, right? But in the case of radio buttons, they all have to have the same name, or else it'll allow you to choose more than one, and then it's not very useful to you. But you do want to specify different values for each one, because then whichever one your user has selected, that's the actual text value that it's going to assign to it if you like send that off with a submission, or if you're trying to grab the value from it. Okay, so to make it checked by default, you can add the attribute checked equals true, or you can just add checked. So in this example here with chocolate, you can see that I've just added checked. There's no equal sign. That just means by default checked equals true. And so that way, when the user comes to the page, one of these is already selected, and it happens to be chocolate because that is always going to be my choice over vanilla. All right, checkbox. Similar, sort of. You would use type equals checkbox, and you have to use a label or else it doesn't make any sense. And you can specify a value if you want to, but it will default to on if you don't. If you're going to be working with it in the DOM, you really want to have a value on it, ideally. But to make it checked by default, same thing. Use the attribute checked. And then, of course, you can actually go and see if it's checked by checking, your object dot checked as a property when you're working with it in the DOM. And I've got an example here. Strawberries, chocolate. Oh, I changed the names and I forgot. M&Ms, pecans, strawberry chocolate, whatever. And then sauerkraut, which I would never choose to put on my dessert. I wouldn't choose it, period. Okay, then the last one here is the drop down. And it's not officially called a drop down, but a lot of times colloquially it's called a drop down. And so I just wanted to point that out, because if you're talking about a drop down, it's the same thing. It's the select input. So you use select instead of input. And you use that as a wrapper. And then inside of that, you have all these option elements that will provide all the different choices that are inside the drop down. So instead of using a label, The option actually just provides for the label by putting the text between the opening and closing tags. And you do need to specify a value. And the first option is always going to be the default value. So a lot of times you'll see that it's set to something like, please select one or something. And then the value is just an empty string. Just so it has like a fallback, but you're not actually making a choice for them. Because in certain circumstances, you want them to make a choice and you don't want to choose for them. You need to make sure that they actually consciously chose something. So this would be how you would do it. Okay, so buttons and form submission. Let's say you have all of those input fields. Ian, you got a question?
Oh, it was just on the previous slide. They were opened with option and closed with label. Is that supposed to be option both times, or is that valid?
Yeah, that's me being in a hurry and not paying attention. Yes, they should be closing with option. I will fix that before I give you guys the PDF. Thank you for pointing that out.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry about that. Okay, so buttons. You can create a button with input type equals submit. It's not, I don't know if I've ever seen that done, honestly. I'm sure it is, but I have never seen it. It's more common to use button. And you can have multiple buttons within the same form, like, form opening and closing tags. But if you do, you have to give them types. So type equals submit means it's going to behave as a submit button, and type equals reset would behave by resetting all the fields back to their default values. And it's typically a good idea, if you're going to have that, to have some sort of confirmation window pop up or something, because it can be easy to do that. And then you'd really frustrate your user if they accidentally just undid everything they typed in. So use that with caution, I would say. But if you don't have a type on your button, the browser is going to choose, and you can still have multiple buttons, but it's going to treat every single one as if it's a submit. So no matter which one you click, it's going to submit the form. But this is, typically what it looks like. You just have a simple button and you get, this is kind of the default on a Mac, what it looks like, but you can style these to your heart's content. And I will show you an example of that in a minute. So as far as submitting goes, on the form tag, one way to submit it, if you're using HTTP, is to put an action attribute on it and set it to a destination URL, where it is that you want to send all the information for processing on some server somewhere. And you're going to do this tonight when you do your studio. And if you don't have an action attribute, it just automatically sends it to the current page and you can do something with it. Also on the form tag, you can use the method attribute to set the method to use. Post is usually used because it's more secure than get. But you can see this example here that I've got this form and I've added the action with some URL. And then the method is set to post. And that's how that's done. So you'll practice with that in Studio. But most of the time, honestly, when I've been using forms in my work, and I'm using them with React or with Svelte or something like that, I'm probably going to just use an event handler, and I'm going to take the data and bundle it up the way that I want it, and then use some sort of other mechanism for making an API call to send that data off. But it can be done either way. So I'm going to actually show you tonight, because your studio is going to be working with HTTP on a form submission, I'm going to actually show you more of what it would look like, the other way, to just use all the form input to change things on the page. And then maybe you would submit it at the end and do something else with it, but it wouldn't necessarily be an HTTP submission directly. So for validation, built-in validation, you can use attributes like required or things like min length on a text input. That the browser is going to actually perform certain validation checks on those before it even allows submission to go through. And then it'll warn you and pop up a little thing. And I'll demonstrate this for you in a little bit before it even allows it. and then it doesn't even try to submit until you fix it. And some things that have special formatting, like email, it'll validate those kinds of things as well. But you can also put in your custom validation with event handlers to, like maybe make sure that a string only has certain types of characters. There can be plenty of other reasons you might do it. And somebody had asked a question on Slack about, what's preferred. I would say that using event handlers and doing it the custom way is preferred most of the time. Just because you can provide very specific feedback to your user in a message on the screen that says, here's exactly what you need to do differently in order to make this work. But you can, if it's very apparent because it's just a matter of they left it blank and you don't have anything else to say, you can just use required. That's fine. The browser will do it for you. But then you're, kind of relegated to whatever the browser's message is and the way it's styled. And maybe you just want to do it because you want to style it your own way, right? So most of the time when I've done it, and when you guys get to Angular, in just a few short classes, I can't believe that we're already in class 15. You'll learn a way to actually do a little bit of this, probably. We only really scratch the surface with Angular because there's a lot to learn, but I will definitely show you guys a little bit about how validation works when we get there. All right, so I want to actually take some time now to do an example with some code where we're going to work with a form. And I've got a lot of code here, y'all. Don't freak out. I'm going to point out all of the things that I really want you to pay attention to. And then you can pull up this GitHub repo later, and you can fork it and clone it and play with it to your heart's content, or just study it, whatever you want to do. But I want to walk you through the things that are most relevant for tonight's class. So we have, and I've already got this thing up and running over here. It's this page, River City Printing Company. I'm going to bring this over here so it's not quite so massive, because it doesn't need to be. And then we can just get the code going here. All right. So, sorry, give me a second. I didn't bring my water over, and that was a mistake. Okay. We've got a page. I've got, the style sheet with, a bunch of stuff for formatting to make it look, actually styled and not just the default stuff that the browser provides. And then I've got a form, and I've got a header, and I've got a main section with a title. And then I've got this preview section up here. That's this little card that's going to show us, as we're making changes on the form, what it actually looks like, this business card that we're checking out. And then there's the form. And the form has, these different sections. So a place to select the style, and this is where we can kind of see an example of using a select dropdown input with all of the different options and their values. And then we have, different text fields here for entering details. So you've got a name input, an address input. There's, phone and email addresses. I also have a checkbox right here. You'll see for omitting that line. So like if you, it's not going to do anything right now because it's not wired up, right? But if you want to do that, then you can, it'll give them a little control over that. And then quantity is another little drop down. And then we have some radio buttons to decide, do they want regular or premium paper? So, just this little basic form that's a little, for some fake business out there that just kind of will give us a chance to play around with different types of inputs and how we'll work with them in the DOM. So, and you'll notice I do have a reset button, and you'll also notice that I've got the save button, the submission button, and I've got it set to be disabled with the disabled attribute here. And that used to be super popular. It's actually, a lot of people aren't doing it anymore because of accessibility concerns, because of the way that screen readers work and those kinds of things. So I'm going to show you how it works to do it, but you probably will find that it's less, if you're a front-end developer, that you may not ever actually do it this way because it's kind of going the way of the dinosaur in my experience. Yeah, and then I've got a little footer down here with a little information. Okay, so that's the form. And you guys can come back later and study exactly how I applied, you know, the IDs and the names and the types on everything. Oh yeah, I didn't talk about this. There's also a type tell that's for phone numbers. And it doesn't really do anything special in most browsers, but on a phone, it would actually bring up a different screen with just the phone type input with the nine digits and the 0 below and all that. So that can be useful if you're trying to make your, have a kind of a cross device experience for your users. Okay, let's get to the script. So things I already have in place, because we've done this before, we did this in the last class. I created some objects for the elements that were just where we have some information on the page. So these correspond to all of these fields that are up here in the preview. We've got the background that we can make changeable, and we've got all the text, the different lines of text that are going to be here. So we've already got objects for those. We just need to use them. And then I've got a little function down here that we may or may not have time to use to just check and see if the form is completed or not, and run through all of the fields, but we'll see. So let's start by creating objects for all of our form and input elements, because we're going to need those in order to capture their values and then change things on the page with those values, right? So I'm going to do const, and let's just start at the top. I'm going to call it style input and do document.getElement by ID and style input. Now, I recommend that you, for input fields and buttons, that you always give them IDs that specifically say that, because otherwise it starts to get real. You can have multiple things that might have very, very similar names, and it gets a lot easier, especially on this side of things, when you're working in your listeners and whatnot, to keep track of which ones are actually representing inputs versus which ones just represent like other elements on the page that where you're displaying things if you actually put input in the name. So for what it's worth, that's how I'm doing things. All right, same thing, name input and document.getElement by ID, name input. All right, and then we've got address 1 input. Every time. Okay, address 1 input. Okay, and so on and so forth. And I'm going to just give us, oh, I should have done that in a different order. That's okay. Address 2 input. And then we need email input and phone input. And I just did those out of order, but that's okay. All right, and then we also have the quantity input. And the paper, let's just call it paper input. I think that's what I called it, maybe not. So remember I said that radio buttons have to have the same name. That's actually, oh, and so this is another thing to point out. So we're not doing this by ID. We actually need to use the name that is shared between the radio buttons. So there's a different syntax for that. We're actually going to use this syntax that has brackets like this and do name equals. So you can do any sort of custom attribute this way to look up an element. And so I'll say paper, oh shoot, I've forgotten what it was now. Oh, and I also have to use different types of quotes than the other ones I used because they're nested. paper input. So I was being consistent with my other ones. Okay. Yeah. So again, if you have something that's not an ID or a class or something like that, and for radio buttons in particular, this is important, you have to use the name and you want to use those brackets and just do it like this. And that will go find the radio button, like it'll find the radio group, and then the value of whichever one has been selected is going to be paper input.value. Okay. So we can work with that. All right, so let's update the styling of the card preview based on the input. We can see that we've got some different choices here: elegant, floral, geometric, luxe, classic. And there's a number of different things that we can change about the styling in order to make that work. So we're going to, what I'm going to do here is actually use, I believe I showed this to you during the studio review last week. Yeah, but I'm going to use something called event delegation, where I actually, am I going to do that? I'll do that later. Sorry, this is only one input. I'm tripping. Okay, style input. So all we have to do is just add an event listener to this one input. And in this case, I'm going to make it a change. I think that'll work. And then, so if the value changes, it should update this. And so anything we do now, if we actually come over here and like click on this and choose something, that's a change event. So now we have access to this, and so I can check them one by one. So if style input dot value, and I can check it by the string value that I assigned. And remember over here, when we're looking at this, these options each have a value, right? So those are the strings that I'm actually looking for. Which one of these is it, right? So I'm going to say if it's elegant, then we want to change several things. So we want the card background that I've already defined. And we want the style.background image. And it's camel case. I almost did that hyphenated. We're going to set that to this value URL. Oops, I'm sorry. Hold on. Here we go. All right. I'm going to get this straight. Okay, URL. And then I would just need to put images / I think I got to look at my images now. Hold on. Yeah, elegant background.png. So I put these in a folder adjacent to this. So if I do it like that, it should, I can't remember if I need the slash here or not. Let's try it out and see what happens if I change it. It does, it changed it. Look at that. So, so that's step number one. And then we also want to change the card text. Oh, no. I also want to change the justification. Actually, in this case, I want it to be the same. I want it to be in the middle, but because they could potentially keep changing it, I need to specify that I want it to be in the middle in case it needs to be changed back to that from some other position. So I'm going to do the same thing, card background dot style dot justify content. This is a Flexbox property, by the way, for those of you who may have investigated Flex. And in this case, I want it to be center. And then card text, already defined up there at the top. We want this, and this again is align items is another Flex property, and I also want that to be centered. And then card text dot style dot color for the text color. I want that to be, oh boy, I don't have that hex code handy. It's in my solution, which is in a different branch. Alexandra, you got a question?
Yeah, you may have gone over it already, but What is that justify content?
Oh, yeah, I was just saying justify content and align items are both Flexbox properties that allow you to vertically and horizontally align things.
Okay, so
You put it like-
specifically justify content. So I guess it functions as like another align items type object.
Yeah,
or-
like I can show you an example. I just gotta find it here. Like there's an example of justify content where instead of
Okay,
center, I've given it space between. There's an example of justify content center. And then up here, yeah, there's an example of align item center. And it's anytime you have display flex, you can use those properties.
okay, and flex is like kind of a
It's a,
global, like it's loaded in already.
yeah, all you have to do is set certain things like that. And then everything else kind of, you can use all the other stuff and it flows. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so where was I? Script. Right. Okay, so we changed the color. I'm just gonna have to change it. No, to some nasty color for now because I can't remember my hex code. That's on me. All right, name. So now we're going to the name element that I have. So we can specifically change the font family of this. Oh man, I was not. And again, camel case. And also style. Wow. Okay. And this, I can't remember what the font is. And you know what, hang on just a second, guys. I know I've got this on my clipboard. So I'm gonna grab something over here. Oh, come on. I'm on my other monitor in case you're wondering. New thing, go to the clipboard. And there it is. All right, haha, now I can cheat. This is my solution. Oh yeah, that's it. So something I had not mentioned yet is that I installed some Google Fonts. It's very easy to do. You go to Google Fonts and tell it which ones you want, and it gives you exactly what you need to paste into your head for these links. And then they're available to you, and then you just use them in your style sheet like this, and you name it just like any other font, as long as it's been loaded into your HTML file. So I can essentially do that exact same thing in my script and just change the font family of this particular one. And I'm going to change it to, I lose it, Cormorant. Yeah, that's right. Cormorant SC Serif. And I forgot that it's going to make me use, yeah, to nest my quotes properly, except for I've still got one off. There we go. All right. And then the last thing, oh no, was that it? No, font family, font size, right? I was going to change the font size because they're not all quite right. They're all called quite the same. And I was being fussy because that's me, I'm extra. Okay. All right. So now let's see what happens. I change it to elegant and boom, we've got a new font up here and new color. And if I had changed the alignment and all those things, then you would be seeing those change back. But we haven't done that part yet. Alexander, you have another question?
No, sorry, that just didn't go away. That's my bad.
Yeah. Okay, Mitchell.
Yeah, real quick, when you installed those Google fonts, was that by like font family, or is that like you can drag in like all of Google's default fonts?
You choose specific ones. Like you can come back later and look at this, but like you can see it, it says, you know, family, these are query parameters, right? So family equals Montserrat, you know, and I've got specific weights specified that I can have. And then there's another family, and then there's another family. So yeah.
So it basically made a palette for you, or you made a palette and then it gave you a URL to pop in there.
And it'll give it to you all your selections, and it just gives you this thing and you just copy and paste it into your head. It's super
Great,
easy.
thanks.
Yeah. Okay. So, so we've got, you know, this essentially, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this and actually for the sake of time, I'm just going to go get everything from my solution because I need to move on to the next thing. You're going to get the point of this in just a second. Okay, so now I've counted for all 5 styles. Elegant, floral, geometric, luxe, and classic. And every single time I've changed all the same properties because, like I said, from one to the next, it could change and then you'd have to change it back. So let's see how this works. I change it to elegant. I change it to floral. It moves. Everything over here is right justified now, and down here at the bottom, we get a different background, different text. This one moves it all the way over here with different colors and a different font. And then we've got, back to center, but, different color and different background. So that was, part 1. All I'm doing right there is making use of data that I'm getting from here, the value from this input, and completely changing something on my page using JavaScript. Mitchell, you have another question?
No, I just forgot to pull my hand out. Sorry.
Okay, all right. So that was part 1. Okay, so we can also, of course, update it with the correct information. So as they're typing in their name or their address, we can see that updating on the card. So the first thing we want to do is add a listener to the name input, right? And we called that name input. So I'm going to add an event listener. In this case, instead of change, you can use change, but here's the difference. If you use change, you have to wait until the user hits enter or clicks out of the thing and it's no longer in focus. And then it registers as a change and it would update. But in this case, it's actually kind of cooler to see that change as they're typing. So then you can use the input event instead, and it'll change like character by character as they're typing. All right. So in this case, we have 2 things we want to do. We want to update the inner HTML of this name thing. Actually, this is the only thing we want to do right now. We may or may not do the completion thing later. So I access whatever's inside my name object. So remember, again, the name input is the field down here. This name refers to this line up here. I've got like a P or something that I think has that, or no, it's what is it, an H something. Nope, it's just a span. Okay, it's just a span, but it's inside this div that had the card text. So you can see how I kind of like used these in a way where I can use this one and apply changes to this entire group, or I use these individual ones and apply changes just to them. So right now I'm interested in changing this from your name to whatever it is that they typed in. That's what we're doing. So I'm going to set it equal to name input dot value. So let's see if we can watch this happening. I'm going to choose a interesting thing, and we're going to say John Smith, and look at that. As I'm typing, you can see it updating in the preview up there on the page. So this is where creating a dynamic experience for your user gets really cool. All right, and I'm going to do the same thing with the other ones. So we can kind of, copy this down, and I'm going to do the address 1 input, and do address 1. And then actually do this for 2. And then we have, and on the phone number and email, I actually am going to copy this over. It's a little different. The phone and email, I've put them together on the same line. So what I'm going to do is, let me copy this from here and put it in, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, so I'm taking the input, I'm listening for the input from the user, and then I'm going to set the inner HTML of the phone email line, that's this entire line over here, equal to, and I've used a template literal here so I can kind of piece it together. So I've got phone input dot value with a pipe and then email input dot value. And then I've used this or operator, and you can actually use this when you're putting content on your page to say, use this, but if it's not available, then use this instead. So it's possible that email input dot value is still an empty string. And of course, we know that's falsy, right? So if it tries to evaluate that as a Boolean, it's going to come back false. So then it's going to say, oh, well, if that's not available, then let's go to the next thing. This is very, very commonly done. So let's see this happen. We've got a name, we've got an address. So let's go down to the phone number. I'm going to start putting in a phone number. And you'll notice that as I'm changing it, the whole line is still there, but it's still putting your email on the right side because there's no value for that yet. That's what that does. But if I actually come down here, oh, I need to actually add it first. So hold please. Again, I'm going to copy it because of time. So hold on. Yeah. If I can get my fingers to cooperate. There we go. All right, so for the email input, I'm going to do the same thing. And this was actually, yeah, phone email. It's the same thing that I want to override. It's the same object up here, the phone email line. But this time, I want to actually check for the possibility of there being a phone input value already, or maybe there's not. But if I put the phone in there first, and then I come over here and put the address in and say, you know, John at Smith, then the phone number, the value is there. So it's putting them both together as you would expect, because this already does have a value. So then it doesn't need to go and use your phone. Okay, that's as much as I'm going to say about that right now. So the other thing that we need to do here, I've got a note here, is that the second line on the address preview, we want to make that disappear if this button is checked. And right now that's not happening. So we can actually add something that I did not add here. So we need to go get it. Hold on. I'm just going to grab it from here. All right. So after the address, I actually have that other checkbox input that I forgot to put in here, and I've called it omit address to. So we can use that and add in, you know, omit address to, add event listener. And in this case, I think, do I need to use a change on this one? I think I need to use a change. Oh, I guess it works for both input and change, so that's fine. But we'll stick with change because it's literally a binary choice, right? It's either on or it's off. And so what we want to do though, is we want to say that if it is checked, then we want to change the display property of address to up here to be none. But if it's not checked, then we want to make sure it's blocked so that it's showing, which is kind of the default. So we're checking the checkbox, and this checked property automatically exists on a checkbox, even if you don't have it specified when you set your HTML in your HTML file. This is how you can go and check it. And so this is a Boolean. It's either true or false. So all I have to say is if it's checked, then, you know, display none, otherwise. So you can see here as I click this, that the address to line up here is disappearing, right? Adding, disappearing. So that's working. All right. I'm keeping an eye on the clock. I'm going to go a little bit longer here. So if we wanted to actually like, let's talk about the submission first. Let's talk about just the basic submission. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the disabled off of here so we can just play with it as is without having to do the whole form. So I want to show you what happens if you have certain types of validation on it. Right now, I have required on everything except for address to. Is that true? Input, yes, I have required on this one too. I used Prettier to clean this up, and it put them all. I took it out of one line because it was so long. Okay, so we can actually come in here and I can say that I want to check the save button, which does that exist yet? I don't think I've added it. Yeah, I added all of the form inputs, but I didn't actually put the buttons in here. So we need those if we're going to work with them. So like I said before, just keep in mind, anything that you want to be able to work with, it's a good idea to declare them all up here at the top so that you can use them in any listener you want, and they're always going to be in scope. Oh, and I didn't do the quantity input. That's because, yeah, that's because these, we're not doing anything with them right now. But we, yeah, let's see. I might end up just not finishing all of this, guys, but you can always come back and look at the solution in the GitHub link later. So I'm here. Okay, so I want save button. And I'm going to add an event listener, and it's going to be a click event. And I'm going to say function. And in this case, I'm going to capture the event as the parameter of this anonymous function, because I want to use it. So I'm going to, is that true? Do I want to use it? Maybe not in this one, but if nothing else, what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log a message that just says, I clicked the button. And then, we can check to make sure that event listener is working. And I have not been using my dev tools at all, guys, but normally you really, really should. And by the way, I have to get it out here, but if we look at this form and look at all this content out here, and actually specifically look at the preview, if we want to look at what's being changed as we're changing it, you can see as I change things, it's updating all of those properties in the preview. It's flashing to show you all the changes it's making. And it's putting all of the information in line, like we talked about in the last class. Okay, but I can come over here to the console, and if I click the button, they'll say I clicked the button. But you'll notice that it also put up this little validation that said, please fill out this field. So because I had the required attribute on this input, the browser is actually validating it for me and saying, hey, you can't submit this. It's required. You have to fill this out. So I could fill this out and, put my name and then try it again. And now it's going to validate on the next one. So it's going to take them one at a time from top to bottom and validate until it goes through all of them. So that's basic submission. And then, of course, if I reset, it's going to, automatically just blank everything out. But notice what didn't happen when I clicked reset. It didn't update the customizations that I made up here, right? So you would have to actually that's when you need a handler on your reset button to do all of that for you. So right up here, I'm going to actually add that in. And I'm just going to cut and paste it because it's got a lot to it, and I want to make sure that I get it all and do it quickly. Okay, so essentially what we've got here is first we want to confirm with the user, are you sure that you want to start over? And then if they say no, then you're going to prevent the default. This is where we need the event, by the way. I was misremembering. I don't really need it for this because I'm not doing anything with that. But here we capture the event, and then we can say event.prevent default that will keep the form from blanking out or from the page from submitting. Because if you click any button, the browser is going to go, oh, we want to refresh the page and reload it. And you don't want that. If they said no, you want to keep it exactly the way that it is. So that's kind of the first thing you can do. And then you can exit this function early with a return, and then it won't execute any of the code that comes after it. And it'll only do this if they actually said, yes, I do, in fact, want to do this. So then we change the inner HTML of everything up in the card up here back to the default values of, your name, the generic stuff. We reset all of the styling back to default. And we also, if the save button had been disabled, we'd want to, change that back. I'll take that off for now. So let's say I choose this and I put in a name, and blah, 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 and then a@b.c, just so it passes. If I try to save this now, it should go through just fine. Yeah, and it blanked it out because saving will actually, blank it out and reload the page. But, and I don't have anything attached to this to like, say, I'm sending this information anywhere or I'm doing anything with it yet. So, but if I actually change some things and, go through and do all of this, and then I reset, it's going to pop up this thing. Are you sure you want to start over? And if I say cancel, it keeps everything exactly as it is. But if I say okay, it actually does it. It updates everything up here. It looks like the one thing it did not do was to put address line 2 back. So that's something I actually failed to do. I would also need to change this address to display property back to block to make sure that it puts it back. Cool. Let's double check that that works. Yep, it puts it back. Cool. All right. I want to get you guys off to Studio. So I think the only other thing I really want to show you is the form submission. So maybe instead of putting something on the save button, you actually want to run something at the point at which it is trying to actually submit the form. Because this is only going to run after it passes the built-in validation. So if you were going to do any sort of custom validation, you probably would want to put it here. And you could put it either place. But is that true? Yeah, I guess you could put it either place. So I can actually choose the form. And did I set up the form? I don't think I set up the form. Okay, let's actually put the form up here. Oh, for the love. Form, const form. Okay, equals document. And I'm going to use queries. Oh man, every time. I'm going to use query selector because in this case, I just want to go off of I just want it to use form because it's just the element selector, right? There's no ID on that. So I can use that and actually put the listener on the form instead. And make that the the event would be the submit event. And can't remember if I need that or not. Let's see. Let me go check my solution, make sure I'm doing what I mean to do. Yeah, so essentially what I've got here is just this idea. We're not really adding anything to a real database here. We aren't going to be working with that kind of stuff until Unit 2. But I can at least provide them with some feedback, like an alert that says, hey, that looks great. Your custom design has been saved before it blanks out the form and, finishes everything. So to do this, I actually have to fill this entire thing out. So let's go with, John Smith and Main Street and, St. Louis, Missouri. And we'll do 314-555-1234 and john@smithconsulting.com. Sure. And let's say he wants 1,000 on premium paper. So I say save this design and I get the alert. And you'll see that I clicked the button over here and the console is coming from the event listener that I put on the save button. But this is coming from the fact that the browser is honoring the built-in functionality that when you submit the form, the entire form, that it captures that submit event and goes ahead and handles everything for you. I've got notes in the rest of the solution, the other things that I don't really have time to go over right now. So I encourage you, if you want to play around with this, you can get it from GitHub later. I'll have the links in the slides when I post those. Does anybody have any more last questions? I feel like I saw somebody's hand up, but I was waiting. Mostly, this was a lot, and I know it's a lot of code, but I wanted to kind of give you examples of a little bit of everything and show you some of the other ways that you can use these things, because you can do a ton, and you can, you can make really cool stuff. So hopefully that inspires you to really get in here and play around with this, because the DOM is pretty powerful when you get comfortable with it. Okay, so your studio tonight, you are going to fork and clone the starter code from launch code for the instructions. Is that true? I think that is true. Yes. Let's go to the actual studio. Yes. So here's the studio repository right down here. But basically, you're going to be making a one-stop shopping type search feature where somebody can put in a term and they can choose which of these search engines they want to use, and then go, and then it'll take them to that page and do the search for them. And you're going to be making a request with an action and method on the form tag, like I talked about. And it's going to walk you through all of this step by step. I do want to point out that, again, you're going to be using this special syntax here. In this case, you're going to use input and then name equals engine like this to grab anything that equals that engine. So that's those radio buttons. And this is exactly what I was doing. And then, of course, you can also use that, dot checked to see if something is checked. And then just don't forget, because it's so easy to forget, that when you're working with these things, you have to actually check the value. You have to put dot value on it to get the value from it. You can't just use the object itself, right? Yeah, so this is, and then there's some bonus missions with like validation and CSS if you have time. So go ahead and head off and take your little break and then get going on that. And let's see if I have anything else here. Yep, upcoming classes, JSON and Fetch next Monday, and on Thursday we'll do TypeScript, which is pretty cool. Allows you to actually specify what type your data is, but otherwise it's very similar to JavaScript. Yeah, that's it. You guys head off, and I will see you. Why don't we come back at 8:10, because this one definitely will not take long to go through. It'll give you a little bit more time.